technical difficulties so far, so that makes me happy, happy, happy. I hope you guys are all hanging in there in our new norm of Plant Kingdom, brought to you by me from my house. But yes, I'm in a good mood today because, like I said, so far, no technical difficulties, which makes me happy. I'm pulling up the lecture right now because we got a decent amount of lecture to cover before we have our in-class assignment 5, which is happening today. Around 11, we will start it. We're going to start it a little earlier today. And you guys will have, once it begins, you guys will have 25 minutes of time to complete it, which is 5 more minutes than before. We are almost done with the course. We're really getting there. We got conifers left, we have angiosperms left, and that is it. So let's get to it. Let me pull up this PowerPoint. I think I got it here. Share content. I'm getting a little bit better at this whole online format, but just wait till I annotate, then we'll see how good I am. Okay. All right, come on, share. Okay. Let's. Okay. Can you guys see the PowerPoint slide? Yes. All right. Everyone says yes. That's good. All right. Yay. There are people out there. It's not just me talking to my computer. All right. Let's do it. So, let's do it. Before we do, I need to remind you guys that, yes, even though this is a whole new weird life, we are doing a class. And we do have an exam. We have another exam coming up. Guys, we have literally, the class is almost over, right? It's what today? The 7th of April. And then, I mean, I think our last class is close to the 1st of May. And so we really, I mean, we're basically at the end. But we still have other things like the exam coming up. Before that, I have put on Blackboard the study guide. I think it should be available already. So if it's not, let me know. But the study guide is there and it tells you what the exam covers, but it covers everything from the ferns to the conifers. I have a question here. Since I'm good at it now, could I please do a step-by-step tutorial for recording a shared screen? Need it for an assignment in another class. All right, so if you're using WebEx, I'm not as familiar with Zoom, but I assume it's kind of similar. But if you're using WebEx, basically at the very top of if you host a meeting, and you know what, Prince, I'm happy to, if you would like to host a meeting for me to practice this, we can do that later today, or even, yeah, later today after the in-class assignment and things. I'm happy to help you troubleshoot that. Yeah, so let's do that. Send me an email, Prince, and we'll coordinate it, and I will teach you the little that I know about how to use this online platform. I'm happy to do that for anyone else as well who needs to adapt to this new thing. All right, so yes, exam is next week, and a week from today, actually, and the study guide is available on Blackboard. So the last class we covered ginkgo. I have to be honest, that ginkgo lecture is not one of the more exciting ones. So thanks for bearing with me. But it's material we have to cover, so it is what it is. But we covered ginkgo last time, and then today we're going to start and hopefully finish the conifers. My goal today is to finish the conifers, even though it says it's 2 lectures. I've shortened it into more of 1 lecture, and I'm hoping we can get through it so that you guys can use Thursday to study. That is my goal. Let's see if we can do that. All right. I always like to get organized before we move forward. So we're worked our way through the vascular plants. We've left the spore plants. We are in the seed plants, and we are still dealing with the gymnosperms. We've talked about the cycads so far. We've talked about ginkgo, and today we're going to talk about the conifers. So conifers. Most of us are comfortable with some form of a conifer in that for some of us, we've seen a Christmas tree before or something like that. Conifers are often in that shape and look like that, but in other cases, not so much, but we will go through it today. But conifers are a very important part of the plant kingdom and sometimes occur in forests where they dominate the forest, which we'll talk about today. So conifers are in the phylum Coniferophyta, conifers, and the name conifer comes from the Latin conifer, which means to bear cones. To bear cones, bear or have, to have cones. And the word is bearer, to bear, and then conus, cone. So conifer means to bear cones, and conifers are the only plants that have cones. Sometimes if you look at the text, which I doubt many of you are, but if you are looking at the textbook, I know sometimes they say something like the cycad cones. No. There's no cones other than the conifers, period. We are well into the vascular plants. And so we should already expect to see this slide, right? That the conifers have a dominant sporophyte that's long-lived, and their sporophyte is vascular, has true root stems and leaves. We should already expect that. So, sorry, noise from my front door, of course. Mailman. Or mailwoman, I think. Yeah, I'm not sure today. Anyways, yes. So conifers, they tend to be very large trees, and they tend to have a lot of wood and bark. So whenever you see something that says abundant wood and bark, what the light bulb that should go off is that it has a lot of secondary growth, which they do. And we will talk about that a little bit more later, not in as much detail as maybe before. And conifers are awesome because some of the largest trees living in the world are conifers. For example, here is a slide showing you some notable conifer sizes. Let me pull it up here too so I know where I'm going. I'm kind of winging it as we go here. Yeah. So check this out. All right, this slide shows relative sizes that certain conifers can reach. Just so that you know, nope, don't go there yet. Just so that you know, I can annotate, which I know will make Ashley happy. See this little dot down here? That's supposed to be a human. That little dot is supposed to be a human to give you an idea of the size of these trees. So that's a human. Then we have like a house here or some building, but then check it out how tall some of these trees get, right? 70 feet, 130 feet, 140 feet, almost 400 feet. And actually this is a tree we're going to highlight right now. And it's grown since I've had this slide. So it's even more now. It's like closer to 400 feet. I think it's like 380 something now. So yeah, pretty amazing how big these trees can get. So speaking of that tree is the tallest living tree in the world. You can look it up. This is a real thing. This is not a photoshopped image. This is an actual tree, and it's a type of a coastal redwood, which is in the genus Sequoia. Some of you may have heard of Sequoia before as being something that refers to a large tree. But check out this crazy tree, this crazy big tree coming out of the forest. Look at how puny all the other trees are compared to it. And similarly, this is somebody, again, this is a human sitting at the base of that tree, and wow, I mean, like, this is a tall, well, that might not be the same tree, but that's still a type of sequoia. But the point is, super, super, super big, really big, tall. Here's another way to look at that same tree. So here you have Big Ben, and then the Statue of Liberty. And yes, Hyperion is bigger than both, which is what? Just crazy. I mean, it's hard to think of something, of a tree being that big, but yes, it is very, very cool. Very cool. Not only are conifers the tallest tree in the world, but they also make up some of the oldest, actually the oldest living trees in the world happen to be conifers. So this is a type of tree called bristlecone pine. It's a pine. It's in the genus Pinus. And some of these, in fact, the oldest one, which is called Methuselah, is almost 5,000 years old. But these trees are, so when I say that this tree and some of these trees are over 4,000 years old, I don't mean in evolutionary time. I mean that tree, that one tree has been alive for over 4,500 years. Pretty amazing. Scientists actually use these trees to help study certain types of diseases, and try to use these trees to study things like certain processes like aging, because it's mind-boggling that something can, to us who don't live for yeah, Arella says if only it could talk for real. I mean, it would, who knows? I mean, it can tell us a lot of stuff. I agree. I wish it could talk, but but yeah, it's like very hard to think of an organism living for thousands of years. And in the case of conifers, yep, we have some species that actually can do that. All right, so conifers, there's about 500 to 600 species worldwide, and the majority of the species are evergreen. And what this means is that the leaves stay on all year, including in wintertime. Not all conifers are evergreen, but the majority of conifers are evergreen. And for those evergreen species, not only do the leaves stay on all winter, but also the leaves can live for several years. Oops. Okay, come on, go forward. Here we go. So there are these places in the world that are called the Circumaural Forests. And in those forests, conifers dominate. What that means is, oh my God, my cat, hold on. Okay. Sorry, I have a very old cat and he likes to yell occasionally. He's doing that right now. Yes, so in these Circumaural Forests, conifers dominate. And what I mean by, I can show you the cat later, but he's very loud and old, and so we'll wait a little bit for that. The conifers dominate in these forests, and what that means is that the majority of the species that occur in the Circumaural Forests are conifers. As you can see in this picture, there's not one tree in this picture that is not a conifer. So we'll talk just a little bit about these Circumaural Forests. So Circumaural Forests are actually the largest forest region in the world. So this is a map taken from the top of the globe, right? You have this is the North Pole right here in the center. And circum means around, like maybe you've heard the word circumference, right? Around the circle. And borealis refers to the north. And so the word circumaural forest means a forest that grows around the north. And it happens to be in a circle because of where the land is. And let's go forward. In Russia, where the majority of the Circumaural forest is, it actually takes up about 12 million kilometers squared. And so that's larger than the Amazon rainforest. So I know, obviously, the Amazon rainforest is important. And so it is something we talk about a lot, maybe colloquially, because it has a lot of species and there's a lot of charismatic species there, and etc. But in terms of largest forest, Circumboreal forest is way larger than the Amazon forest, and in the even more so that only part of it is bigger, right? So all of the Russian Circumboreal forests are larger than the Amazon forest. And then in the Americas, we have the rest of the Circumboreal forest, which is predominantly in Canada, and that contains about 30% of the world's boreal forest. So why do I highlight this forest? Well, not just because it's very big, but also because these forests are really important for our Earth in that the forests and the associated peatlands, which might have like sphagnum moss in it, but these circumboreal forests contain 5 times as much carbon as the temperate forest and about 2 times as much as the tropical forest, which would include the Amazon rainforest. So they're very, very, very important to our Earth in that the circumboreal forest, which is predominantly made up of conifers, are these major parts of the primary producers on Earth that remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So why are conifers important? They remove, because of how many there are in the northern latitudes, they are responsible for removing a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere, and they have a lot of economic importance. So they are used for lumber, very commonly used in the paper industry, furniture, fuel, and then other products that we get from conifers, including things like turpentine, the jewelry that's called amber, and then food, even food. Yeah. So a lot of times people might think of conifers as not being a big food source, but if you've ever eaten pine nuts, they're called pine nuts, but they're not really nuts because they're gymnosperms. But pine nuts actually come from conifers. And they take a long time to grow, which is part of the reason they're so expensive. All right. So many conifers are what we call xerophytes. So the way you say that word is xerophyte. And xerophytic plants are adapted to dry conditions. So the word xerophytic, comes from the Greek xeros, which means dry. And then, of course, as we know, phyte, right, which is plant. And so xerophyte, plant phyte that lives in a zero dry environment. A lot of conifers live in xerophytic environments. And what that means is they live in environments that don't have a lot of water available. So some conifers live in really sandy environments, as we see here on the right. But as we just talked about, a lot of conifers live in northern latitudes where the water that is available tends to be frozen most of the year. So if you're living in the circumboreal forest and temperatures are very, very low, sure, there might be a lot of snow or water around, but it may be frozen and therefore not available to the plant. Okay, so conifers live in these dry. Oh yes, Masahiro asks, what about the pine barrens? Another good example of this. Yep, pine barrens are also a xerophytic environment. Yep, and so very common type of habitat for the conifers to live in these dry. So yeah, in Jersey, there's the pine barrens, and those are predominantly made up with a lot of conifers, and those are dry environments. Good, yeah, exactly. So how do conifers live in these dry environments? Well, the main reason they're able to is because they have leaf adaptations that allow them to. So let's go through that. Conifer leaves, they're adapted to these dry environments. Part of the way that they're adapted to these dry environments is the shape of the leaf. So let's move this here. I'm forever paranoid that I'm going to just spill all my beverages on my many computers here that I have in front of me. Yeah, so Some conifers have what are called needle-like leaves, and I think for most of us, that's probably the most common type of leaf shape we think of. Again, it's kind of like Christmas tree or holiday decoration type of a conifer. But some conifers have scale-like leaves, as shown here. And some conifers have what are called awl-like leaves. Awl is a tool. Actually, I have a photo of it here. It's a tool that maybe not all of us are familiar with, but if you've ever done any leather working or shoe cobbling, an awl is a tool that's used in those practices. And so when people were describing what conifer leaves look like, I guess people used awls a lot. And so we have the needle-like leaves, scale-like leaves, and these awl-like leaves. Some conifers, even they are still adapted to these dry conditions, but their leaves are a little bit more laminar. And what I mean by that is, remember parts of the leaf, right? You have a petiole, which is the thing you hold, and then the wider green part, which is the lamina or blade. So when we say that some conifers have laminar leaves, it means they're more similar to that kind of flat-ish leaf that we're used to. But even in the case of this conifer shown, the leaves are more laminar-like. However, they're still reduced in surface area. So part of how conifers are adapted to xeric conditions is because of their leaf shape. Another way that conifers are adapted to these xeric conditions is because they actually have sunken stomata. So their stomata, I think I highlight them. Yes, I do. They're still on the outside of the leaf, but instead of being right toward the outside, they're actually sunken in. So here, I don't know if I can do this. So I'm circling them, but you can see like here, this is a stomata right here, and they're slightly more inside of the. Oops, that one didn't work out. Slightly more inside of the leaf than they were previously. And what this does is when your hole, right, stomata means holes, when your hole is kind of more inside of the leaf, if wind blows across the leaf, ooh, I like even feel the wind. If the wind blows across the leaf and moves water vapor away, the stomata can kind of keep a little microhabitat a little further into the leaf, and there won't be as much water loss because it's not feeling the effects of that wind. It's a little bit more down. So to kind of finish this part up, conifer leaf adaptations to living in a xeric environment, right? They have a reduced surface area, which we talked about, thick cuticle, the stomata are sunken, and then there's these other cellular adaptations that help the leaves deal with living in a dry condition. So one is that they have this new layer that's called a hypodermis. Hypo means below, dermis means the skin. Below the skin, it's below the epidermis. You have epidermis, then hypodermis. That helps prevent water loss. You no longer have spongy mesophyll cells, and you have another layer that's called an endodermis, which prevents water loss. So here's where those things are located. See, here's your epidermis on the outside. Just below that, the hypodermis. You do have mesophyll cells, but it's only palisade now, no spongy. Don't worry about transfusion tissue. I don't care about that. There's your stoma and your sunken stomata. And then the endodermis, which is that other layer that I talked about that's new, is it kind of surrounds that vascular bundle and just gives an extra layer of protection when it comes to water loss and helps regulate like what goes in and out of the vascular strand. Conifers also have this other thing that's called a resin duct. So a resin duct is, when you look at a cross section through a conifer leaf, so if we go back here, see these, see these like holes? Yeah. Those are the resin ducts. And resin ducts have this special fluid inside. So resin, it's very sticky. And what it does is it's sticky and it's aromatic. Has a lot of like volatiles in it. And so if you've ever touched a conifer tree, or you think of like, oh, that pine tree smell, right? Maybe that thing you hang in your car in the shape of a conifer. Well, that smell, that like, conifer or pine tree smell is because of this resin. And so what the resin does, it's sticky, and it prevents fungal infection by being sticky and trapping fungus from coming in, prevents it from moving into the tree. But also the, like I said, that kind of aromatic, volatile nature of the resin also prevents fungal infection. And insects don't really like to eat the resin, so they tend not to want to eat the conifer leaves. And that also discourages herbivory in general. Ashley's asking, is resin flammable? It usually is, yes. So if you ever have a fire pit or fireplace and you're looking to start the fire without and having trouble, I've pine cones and things like that actually that have a lot of resin on them are a good way to do that. Yep, and it smells nice. So some of you might be familiar with this. This is something that's called amber. So that resin that we were just talking about, millions of years ago, there were conifers and they had resin ducts as well, and they secreted their resin. And over time, this resin can form this rock-like hard structure that we call amber. And sometimes insects and other small animals got caught in that resin millions of years ago. So you actually can see fossils of the animals trapped in this ancient resin. If you ever saw Jurassic Park, when they're like harvesting the DNA from the mosquito, yeah, that mosquito was trapped in here. If any of you are familiar with Phil Barden at NJIT, he actually studies ants that are usually fossil ants that are trapped in this resin. Mm-hmm. Okay, now let's talk more about the conifer as a plant. So most conifers have a taproot system. We saw taproot system already when we talked about the cycads. And taproot system, which is shown on the left, I told you before, it's kind of like a carrot. It's kind of like a carrot in the sense that you have this thick primary root that goes down, and that makes up the majority of the root system. This taproot on the left, as opposed to fibrous root system, which you could see here on the right. Fibrous root, there's not really one primary root that's going down. It's more like a bunch of softer roots coming out, fibrous roots coming out from the base of the plant. So conifers have a taproot system. Most of them have a taproot system similar to what we saw in cycads. And as you might remember from that awesome documentary I had you watch, conifers have a mycorrhizal association with soil fungi. So remember in the documentary assignment where there was that whole section about Douglas fir trees and how the old trees actually transfer glucose and sugar products to the young trees that are too small to get any sun, so they can't really do photosynthesis. Douglas fir trees are conifers, and so that's an example of what I'm talking about here, in that they have this mycorrhizal association with the fungi. So in that relationship, I have it here. In that relationship, the mycorrhizal fungi provide trees with water because they help increase surface area of the roots. The roots are only so big, but if there's like this long strand of fungus leading away from the roots, and that fungus is able to be close to water or access water in the soil, they can actually transfer that to the plant. And so the fungi provide water and minerals to the tree, and the tree provide glucose and sugar products to the fungi. All right. Got to talk about growth, my favorite topic. No. So if you were to do a cross section through a conifer stem from a young stem, similar to what we saw in, for example, like cycads and also ginkgo, if you were to do a cross section through a young stem, you would see all of those primary tissues. So you would see the epidermis, you would see cortex, you would see eustele, which is the way the vascular tissue is arranged, and the pith. However, if you were to look into an older part of a conifer stem or trunk, you would see lots of secondary growth. So conifers have abundant secondary growth, similar to ginkgo. Ginkgo also has abundant secondary growth. Remember, ginkgo can get 4 feet wide and over 100 feet tall. Abundant secondary growth. Remember, cycads don't really have. Cycads limited. So for the gymnosperms, cycads limited secondary growth, ginkgo and conifers abundant secondary growth. And just as a recall, secondary growth is the result of these 2 lateral meristems, which we've talked about already. But just to remind you, they're called the vascular cambium. That's one of the lateral meristems. And then the cork cambium, both of which produce secondary tissues. Vascular cambium produces that secondary xylem or wood. Secondary xylem is another word for wood toward the inside of the stem. And the vascular cambium produces secondary phloem towards the outside of the stem. And then the cork cambium, which is closer to the outside of the stem, produces phyloderm towards the center, and then cork or phloem toward the outside of the stem. We've talked about secondary growth quite a bit. Here is a cross section through a conifer stem that is almost completely made of secondary growth tissue. Almost. It's almost completely secondary growth tissue. So when I say almost, we still have just a little bit of pith left in this diagram. And pith is one of the primary tissues. But everything else here, for the most part, except for those resin ducts, is the secondary tissues, right? So here, for example, not all of them are highlighted here. But for example, here's your vascular cambium, right? With your secondary phloem on the outside and your secondary xylem on the inside. And the bark, which is a collective term. Botanists love their collective terms. Which bark refers to everything that's outside of the vascular cambium. So bark refers to secondary phloem, cork cambium, cork, and phyloderm. Everything outside of the vascular cambium. Compared to periderm, which refers to cork cambium, and phloem. Yeah, phyloderm, sorry. Yeah. There's a question here from Masahiro. So the pith is crushed into the heartwood. Basically, but more an easier way to think about it is that the secondary xylem will eventually overtake the pith. So as the tree ages and gets wider and wider and wider, there isn't any use for pith anymore. There's more just of a use for the secondary xylem, and so the pith will be overcome by secondary xylem. Let's see, what do I say here? Yes, so this is talking about cell types. This is talking about cell types and of the secondary growth structures of the xylem. So it's talking about the cell types of xylem. So in the conifers, the xylem tissue is composed of tracheid cells, which we will talk more about in the angiosperm lecture. But just the main thing I want you to take away from this slide is that conifers, we call them softwoods because they don't have fiber cells. which when we get to angiosperms, they do have fiber cells. So softwoods are the conifers. Hardwoods are the angiosperms, which we will talk about then. And then, so the xylem tissue of conifers have tracheid cells and no fiber cells. The phloem tissue of conifers is composed of sieve tube cells, and they don't have what are called sieve tube elements and companion cells, which again are things that we will talk about more in the angiosperm class. But the main takeaway message from this slide is that conifers are known as softwoods. Now that doesn't mean that like if I took a piece of conifer and I, hit myself with it, it doesn't mean that it's soft. Right? Like if I cut down a pine tree, I can build a house out of that wood. So it's not like soft in the sense of like it feels soft. We call it a softwood because it doesn't have fiber cells. Okay, so if you were to cut into conifer wood, you would see different cells depending on which way you cut the wood. So, so this is just a piece. This is just a piece of conifer wood, and remember, wood is secondary xylem, right? Secondary xylem. So this is a big chunk of wood. But depending on which side of the wood you look at, you will see different cells more easily. So for example, this is a cross section through the wood. This is what you would see if you chopped the tree down. If you chopped the tree down and then looked at it, this is what you would see. And you can see, for example, don't worry about sieve cells. Well, I mostly just want to get through what these different sections are called. So you have a cross section, which is if you cut the tree down. You have a tangential section, which is like, I don't know if you have taken, so look, right? So look, here is a tree. Oh, I'm going to use a different color because we are in green. I'll use purple. Here is a tree. Here's a tree trunk, right? It's a conifer, so like here's the top. This is a tree trunk. If you were to cut it down, here I'm cutting it down with an axe, what you would see is the cross section, which is on the previous slide, right here. If you were to cut it down, you would see that, and the cells from that orientation. Tangential section, if you've taken, calculus class, here's that same tree. Not so good at drawing. Here's that same tree. A tangent would be, so like here, let's say this is the tree trunk, right? Like if I cut it down and this is the tree trunk. Tangent is a line that runs with the, it runs tangentially from the circle. So like if this is the cross section through a tree trunk, here is a tangent, right? So a tangential section would be like if you cut through like that, or like that, or like, etc. Yeah, that's not, I don't think that's being very helpful. But the point is you could see different things. So from like, for example, let's take tracheid cells, for example. So from the cross section, you can see the tracheids, almost like the opening of a straw, right? So each of these are tracheids. And you can see the top of them almost like a straw. However, if you were to do a tangential section, you would see the tracheids kind of like running vertically. And if you were to look at a radial section, you would still see the tracheids. Here they are again, right here. There's one. There's one. Don't worry about what those circles are right now. But when you do a cut through radial section, the main thing you see is this wood ray. which runs this way. This is the wood ray. And remember before, I think it was in cycads where I was talking about different types of primary growth. Radial refers to a radius. So if this is a cross section through a stem, here's a wood ray. Here's a wood ray. Here's a wood ray. They run like the radius out through the wood ray. And then there's a bunch. So they're almost like spokes of the wheel. This is something you guys will also cover in lab. Here you go. Here's a cross section. So this is a cross section through a conifer trunk. And I just was talking about those wood rays. So those wood rays you could see here very well, right? Here's a wood ray. Here is a wood ray. All of these lines, here's a wood ray that radiate out from the center are those wood rays. And what the wood rays do is they go from the pith and eventually what ends up just being secondary xylem, but they basically transfer sugar horizontally across the stem. That's their purpose. So this whole cutting is a cross section. If you were to cut the tree like this down the middle, whoops, okay, let's try that again. If you were to cut the tree, so this is a cross section that we're viewing. If you were to cut the tree along one of these wood rays, right, that would be a radial section. Or you would see a radial section view. However, remember I told you a tangent, right? It's a line that runs tangentially from around the circle. So in this case, let's use the one that's at the top. If I were to cut the tree like this and look at this here, that would be a tangential view. Anyways, this is a little maybe easier of something that you guys can discuss in lab because the lab covers this as well. All right, let's see how we're doing here. Okay, so remember we looked at the cycads, which are always dioecious, and then we looked at ginkgo, which is always dioecious. Conifers are usually monoecious. It's going to depend on the species. So most of the plants in conifers bear both the male and female sex organs on the same plant. Here is a picture that shows both the male and female structures. So the male structures are on the bottom, and similar to cycads and similar to ginkgo, the male reproductive structures are strobili that have the microsporangia and pollen grains, similar to what we already saw in the previous two plants. Whereas the female reproductive structures are now different in that they are cones. Remember, conifer to bear cones, right? And so female reproductive structures are now something we call cones, and the ovules and later the seeds will be on these cones. So male reproductive structures are on a strobili, just like ginkgo, just like cycads. Female reproductive structures are on cones, whereas in ginkgo they are paired on a stalk, and whereas in cycads they are either in a strobilus or in a fertile crown of leaves. But here in the conifers, as the name conifer tells us, the female reproductive structures are on cones. Here is a detail of the male reproductive structure. So on the left, you see male strobili. And the strobili, remember, a strobilus is a stem with leaves and microsporangia in this case. And so eventually those microsporangia, which we also can call pollen sacs, like we learned already, because they release pollen grains. So here's the male strobili. Eventually, when the pollen grains are made, they will be released from the male strobili and be dispersed by the wind, which you can see in the second picture here. Here's a detail of the female reproductive structures. So cones that bear ovules, you can see the cone cut in half on the left, and those white kind of beigey things are the ovules. Eventually, the ovules will be fertilized, and eventually they will undergo chemical changes to turn into seeds, and then eventually the seeds will be released from the cones, which you can see here on the right. All those things in the middle are the seeds. As I mentioned, when the pollen leaves the male strobilus, it's going to be dispersed by wind. So that's something we say, the agent of pollination. The agent of pollination in the conifers is wind, most of the time wind. And so that's the way that the pollen grains are dispersed. Wind also happens to be the way that the seeds are dispersed. So I think we talk about pollen first. So let's talk about the pollen first. So on the right here, you see a close-up of a conifer pollen grain. And the pollen grains have these things on top. You can see them here on top that are actually air bladders. And what those do is they allow, when the pollen grain is released by the microsporangia, these air bladders help it fly so it can go really, really far. Really, really far. So there you go. Those are the two air bladders on top. And once again, we got another Dr. Casper relic here. So Dr. Casper always says, like, well, what does this look like? And so what does it look like? No guesses? Wow. Ah, that's right. That's right. Mickey Mouse. Yeah, it's something I can never shake. So Dr. Casper, he always made that comparison, right? Here's your conifer pollen grain. You got your two air bladders, and there you go, Mickey Mouse. Okay. Here's another picture of a conifer pollen grain. So yeah, there's two pollen grains on the left. They're at two different stages of their development. But similar to what we saw before, there's the same players that make up the pollen grain. You have the pollen tube cell. You have the generative cell, which is going to, Mickey Mouse is in space. Exactly. The generative cell, which is going to generate the two sperm. And then you have the prothallate cell. In the case of the conifers, unlike what we saw in the cycads and ginkgo, now there are two prothallate cells, and we still don't know what they do. So prothallate cell, who knows? But now there are two, so now there's two things that we don't know what they do. So pollen is dispersed by wind. Seeds are also dispersed by wind. So here are some pictures of conifer seeds, and the seeds have these little wings. So I'll do this really quick. Here is a seed. Here is its wing. And I don't know if you've ever played with those things. People call them, sometimes in my class, they call them like helicopters, seeds that like fall down. Usually those are maple seeds, but these seeds do the same idea, is that when they fall from the top of a tree, the little wing thing makes it fall slower to the ground. Okay. So most conifers are dispersed by wind. When it comes to the seeds, most conifer seeds are dispersed by wind. However, some are actually dispersed by birds. So here is an example of that, where some conifer species actually make what are known as fleshy cones. And the fleshy cones, so on the left here and on the right here, these are actually examples of cones that are more fleshy. Don't look exactly like what we would think a cone would look like, look more like a berry. And the fleshy cones are eaten by birds and are actually bird dispersed. So I'm just looking at the time here. I'm trying to think the best thing to do. Well, let's go for just like 2 more minutes, 2-ish more minutes, and then we'll switch gears. So some conifers have fleshy cones and are bird dispersed. Alternation of generations in conifers is similar to the processes that we saw and detailed in cycads. And we didn't detail it as much in ginkgo because it's also the same processes that we detailed in cycads because they are a gymnosperm. So all the gymnosperms have very similar process of alternation of generations. This slide is going to be a good resource for you guys when you're doing the lab. This is an overview slide of alternation of generations. Obviously, the slides are also posted separately from these recorded lectures. What I will highlight here is just so here on the left is the male strobilus, and on the right is this beginning of a cone. Right. So notice from the male strobilus, you have microsporangia, right? On the female cone, you have these scales that bear ovules. This is a cross-section through a male strobilus. So same structures as we've seen before, stem, leaves, and microsporangia. This is a cross-section through a cone. I can talk later about why a cone is not a strobilus, but don't worry about that right now. But the point is, it's not a strobilus. And if you do a cross-section through a cone, you see these scales, and each scale bears an ovule. So here you go. Cones have the ovules, and the ovules have scales, and the scales bear each 2 ovules. Here is where the scale is. There is a leaf underneath the scale and an ovule on top of the scale. This is just the same thing, but shown underneath the microscope slide. Yep, and actually we can basically finish off there because it's the same process that we've seen before. The microsporangia are going to undergo processes to make pollen grains, right? Which will start with a tetrad of microspores that lead to a microspore that then becomes a pollen grain, like we detailed in the cycads. Similar to we saw before, female ovules will have a functional megaspore, right? Functional megaspore, one functional megaspore that will go on to become the female gametophyte plant with eggs. Go back to the cycad lecture about these processes for more details, because we already covered it there. Yep. So, okay. Eventually, once the sperm from the pollen grain fertilizes the egg of the ovule, the result will be this embryo, and the embryo will grow inside of the female gametophyte, which it will consume, like we already covered in the cycads. And then that will grow on to become the new conifer. So yes, woo, we did it. Yes. So go ahead. I think that the assignment should be open now. Go ahead and get started. Next class, I think I'll send out an email about next class. Go do the assignment. Thank you guys. Have a good day. Yeah, bye.